In the year 1888, when the caresses of the sea breeze touched the palaces of Newport and society pronounced sentences harsher than any tribunal, a young woman dared to defy the destiny imposed upon her. Margaret Astor knew the glory of belonging to the elite, but she also experienced the cruelty of their rejection, the cold of isolation, and the bitterness of betrayed love. Yet when a storm cast at her feet a widowed magnate with 2 motherless children, fate wove a second chance wrapped in lightning and secrets. Could a marriage of convenience transform into the most overwhelming passion? Could true love overcome the wall society had built around her heart? Subscribe to our channel to not miss other exciting stories like this one, and comment on what you love most about period romances. Now, allow us to take you to Newport, where everything was about to change. Chapter 1. The salt-scented breeze of the Atlantic Ocean carried memories that had become bitter reminders of Margaret Astor's fall from grace. From the window of the library, the only room in the family mansion that still retained some dignity, she watched the gulls dance over the sea with a freedom she would never know again. She was 26 years old, yet she felt she had lived many lives, all of them marked by the invisible scar of the scandal that pursued her like a relentless shadow. The Astor property, once the pride of Bellevue Avenue, now bore the wounds of abandonment. Ivy climbed the marble columns with the audacity of something that knew no one would stop it, and the gardens that had been the envy of Newport's high society had become a sea of weeds where wild roses grew without order or awareness. Margaret had dismissed nearly all the household staff months earlier when money began to run short, and her father, devastated by shame, decided to retreat to Boston, leaving her alone in that crumbling golden prison. The memory assaulted her with brutal force, like a dagger that struck the same wound again and again. It was during the summer ball of 1887, in the Vanderbilt ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers, that cast rainbows over silk gowns and impeccable evening coats. Edward Blackwell, her fiancé, the man to whom she had given her heart and her hopes, had humiliated her before all of Newport society. With clear voice and without the slightest tremor, he had announced the end of their engagement, claiming that Margaret lacked the virtue and purity he expected in a wife. The words were vague but devastating, ambiguous enough to fuel the wildest rumors, public enough to ruin her forever. No one had asked if the accusations were true. No one had defended her honor. High society, that beast hungry for scandal, had descended upon her with delight, devouring her reputation in whispers behind lace fans and barely concealed looks of contempt. Margaret had discovered too late that Edward had sacrificed her to protect his own secrets, to hide his gambling debts and scandals with married women. But by then it was too late. The damage was done, irreversible as the tides. Now she lived like a ghost in her own house, accompanied only by Mrs. Brennan, the head housekeeper who had served her family for 30 years and had refused to abandon her. The mornings passed in silence, among books she read again and again, needlework she never finished, and solitary walks along the cliffs when the fog was thick enough to hide her from curious eyes. Margaret had learned to find comfort in solitude, to build walls around her heart so that no pain could penetrate them again. That September afternoon, however, the sky had taken on a leaden grey tone that presaged a storm. Clouds accumulated on the horizon like dark armies, and the wind began to howl through the trees with an urgency that set nerves on edge. Margaret closed the book she had been pretending to read and rose to close the windows, aware that the storm bearing down would be fierce. Mrs. Brennan had already secured the shutters on the lower floor, and the sound of her hurried footsteps echoed through the empty halls of the mansion. It was then that Margaret heard the crash. It was not thunder, but something more earthly and alarming, the crunch of wood splintering, the dull thud of something heavy falling. Margaret ran to the vestibule and found Mrs. Brennan pale as death, pointing toward the east wing of the house. One of the roof beams had given way, and rain began seeping through the cracks, forming puddles on the parquet floor that once had shone like a mirror. The storm had arrived with unexpected violence, and the old mansion, weakened by years of abandonment, would not resist much longer. Margaret made a quick decision. There was an abandoned hunting cabin at the limits of the property, near the pine forest that separated her land from the neighbors. It was not large or comfortable, but its roof was in better condition than that of the main mansion. She wrapped some valuable objects in a shawl, helped Mrs. Brennan prepare a basket with provisions, and together they ventured into the rain already falling with fury, soaking them to the bone as they ran along the gravel path leading to their impromptu shelter. Chapter 2. The cabin emerged from among the pines like a wild apparition, its log walls darkened by moisture and moss climbing its corners. Margaret pushed the door with her shoulder, and the smell of old wood and dry leaves met them with a gust of cold air. The interior was sparse: a stone fireplace, some rickety chairs, a table that had seen better days, and in the corner an old sofa covered with a dusty canvas. Mrs. Brennan, gasping from the effort of their run, hurried to light an oil lamp while Margaret closed the door against the gale that threatened to tear it from its hinges. But they had barely begun to remove their soaked shawls when they heard voices outside. Male voices, urgent, mixed with the cry of a child. Margaret and Mrs. Brennan exchanged alarmed looks before the door burst open, letting in a gust of wind, rain, and 3 figures stumbling inside seeking shelter. The man who entered first was imposing, with a height approaching 6'2", broad shoulders that filled the doorway and a face that, despite being drenched and marked by concern, radiated authority. His eyes, a greyish blue like the winter sea, fell upon Margaret with a mixture of surprise and relief. He carried in his arms a girl of about 5 years old, who sobbed against his chest, while a boy of approximately 8 years clung to his coat with trembling fingers. Water dripped from his dark hair, almost black, that fell dishevelled across his forehead, and his elegant clothes, clearly tailored by some renowned tailor, were ruined by the storm. "Forgive the intrusion," he said in a deep but courteous voice, clearly surprised to find the cabin occupied. "We did not expect to find anyone here. Our carriage overturned on the road when a tree fell in front of the horses. We saw the light and thought—" Margaret had frozen for a moment, not from fear but from the impact of suddenly facing strangers after months of isolation. But the sight of the drenched and terrified children awoke in her a protective instinct she believed dormant. "Please come in," she said in a firm voice, recovering her composure. "The children need warmth immediately." Mrs. Brennan, ever practical, was already stoking the fireplace fire, feeding it with dry logs she found stacked in a corner. Margaret guided the newcomers toward the warmth of the flames, and only then could she see better the man who had burst into her refuge. He was older than her, perhaps 35, with aristocratic features but marked by a sadness that seemed etched into the lines around his eyes. His hands, large and capable, held the child with a tenderness that contrasted with his intimidating appearance. "Thomas Hearst," he introduced himself once the children were close to the fire. "These are my children, William and Clara. I am deeply grateful to you." Margaret felt the world stop for an instant. Thomas Hearst, the industrial magnate whose name appeared in newspapers regularly, the man who had built an empire of steel and railroads, the widower who by rumor had closed his heart after his wife's death 3 years before. What was he doing in Newport, in the middle of a storm, seeking shelter in an abandoned cabin on his own property? "Margaret Astor," she answered, lifting her chin with an instinctive gesture of defiance, expecting to see in his eyes the recognition followed by the contempt that had become so familiar. But Thomas Hearst simply bowed his head with respect, with no trace of judgment in his gaze. The hours that followed passed in frantic and strangely domestic activity. Mrs. Brennan found old blankets in a trunk and used them to dry the children, while Margaret prepared hot tea with the provisions they had brought. Thomas, after assuring himself that his children were safe, went out briefly into the torrential rain to rescue some belongings from the overturned carriage and check the condition of the horses, who fortunately had managed to free themselves and seek shelter under the trees. When he returned, he was even more drenched, but carried with him a suitcase with dry clothes for the children. Clara, once she stopped crying and felt safe wrapped in dry blankets, turned out to be a curious creature with enormous brown eyes and blonde hair that fell in tangled ringlets over her shoulders. William, more reserved, watched Margaret with the intensity of someone who had learned too early to be cautious with strangers. Thomas, while changing the children into dry clothes, spoke to them with infinite patience, answering their questions about the storm and assuring them that everything would be all right. Margaret observed them from the distance of the table, where she was preparing what could be considered an improvised dinner, with bread, cheese, and the preserved goods that Mrs. Brennan had had the foresight to pack. There was something touching about seeing that powerful man, whose business decisions affected thousands of workers, kneeling on the floor of a rustic cabin, carefully buttoning his daughter's dress with clumsy but loving fingers. It was an image that clashed violently with everything Margaret had known in her world, where high society men barely interacted with their children, leaving their upbringing entirely to nannies and governesses. "Your father died recently," Thomas commented when the children had finally fallen asleep on the sofa, huddled under the blankets. He had seated himself across from Margaret at the table, gratefully accepting the cup of hot tea she offered him. The rain continued to pound the roof with fury, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. "I am very sorry," Margaret started, surprised that he knew anything about her situation. "He did not die," she corrected with a soft but firm voice. "He simply decided that Boston was more appropriate for someone of his position than remaining in Newport alongside a daughter in disgrace." The words came out more bitter than she intended, and Margaret bit her lip, regretting having revealed so much. But Thomas did not appear scandalized or pleased by the gossip. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that made her feel truly seen, not as the object of scandal she had become, but as a person of depth and complexity. "I know something of the cruelty of high society," he said after a moment, turning the cup between his large hands. "My wife, Catherine, died 3 years ago, puerperal fever after Clara's birth. For months, the ladies of society pursued me like vultures, each one with a niece or cousin or daughter who would be perfect for comforting the poor rich widower. They did not care that my heart was shattered, that my children needed stability, that I needed time to heal. They only saw an opportunity, a social title to win, a fortune to secure." Margaret listened fascinated, recognizing in his words an echo of her own pain. "And how did you escape them?" Thomas sketched a tired smile. "I became unpleasant, rude even. I rejected all invitations, locked myself in my work, built walls so high that no one could scale them. It worked mostly, but my children have paid the price. William barely remembers his mother, and Clara never knew her. They need a maternal figure, someone who can teach them things that I, try as I might, cannot give them. They need a real home, not just a mansion full of servants." There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the incessant drumming of the rain. Mrs. Brennan had discreetly retired to a corner of the cabin, pretending to sleep, but clearly listening to every word. Margaret felt that something important was happening, something that would alter the course of her life, but she could not identify exactly what it was. "Miss Astor," said Thomas finally, leaning forward with a seriousness that made Margaret's heart beat faster, "I know who you are. I know what they say about you in the drawing rooms of Newport and Boston. And I have lived long enough in this merciless world to know that most scandals are fabricated by bored people with too much time and too little character." Margaret opened her mouth to defend herself, but he raised a hand gently, asking her to let him continue. "In the last few hours I have seen you show kindness to strangers, compassion for my frightened children, and a strength that many society ladies do not possess. I have seen a woman who improvises shelter from this ramshackle cabin, who provides warmth and food, and who has shown not the slightest trace of the weakness or lack of virtue that your ex-fiancé alleged. On the contrary, I have seen a woman of exceptional character, intelligent, capable, and with a heart that has not hardened, despite all you have suffered." Margaret's heart now beat so forcefully that she feared he might hear it. "Why are you telling me all this?" Thomas took a deep breath, and Margaret saw vulnerability cross his face for the first time. "Because I have a proposal for you, one that could benefit us both if you are willing to consider it." The storm seemed to intensify at that moment, as if the entire universe were holding its breath. Margaret waited, feeling that her entire life had been a path leading inexorably to this instant, to this conversation in a cabin lost in the middle of nowhere. "Marry me," said Thomas Hearst, and the words fell between them like stones thrown into a still pond, creating ripples that would expand to change everything. "I do not offer you a fairy tale romance. I cannot promise that my heart will heal enough to love you the way young women dream of being loved. But I can offer you respect, protection, and the opportunity to rebuild your life. You can become a mother to my children, the lady of my home, and no one in Newport or Boston would dare whisper a word against the wife of Thomas Hearst. In return, I only ask that you be good to William and Clara, that you give them the stability they so desperately need." Margaret was left breathless, literally unable to process what she had just heard. Marriage? To a man she had known barely a few hours. It was absurd, reckless, completely irrational. Yet as she looked into those greyish-blue eyes watching her, with a mixture of hope and resignation, as she thought of the years of loneliness stretching before her, if she rejected this opportunity, as she imagined the possibility of having a purpose again, of being useful, of having a family. "You do not know me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "You do not know if I am worthy of trust, if the accusations against me have merit, if I am capable of being the mother your children need." "I know enough," he answered with conviction, "and the rest we will discover together. Life is too short to wait for certainties that never come. Sometimes you must make decisions based on intuition, on those moments of clarity that arrive when we least expect them. And right now, sitting here with you while the storm rages outside, I am certain that this meeting was not accidental. It was destiny offering us both a second chance." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She could say no, return to her mansion in ruins, continue her existence as a ghost until the money ran out completely and she was forced to— What? Become a governess? A lady's companion to some bitter widow? Live on the charity of relatives who despised her? Or she could say yes to this strange magnate with sad eyes and orphan children and build something new from the ashes of her ruined life. "I need to think," she said finally, opening her eyes to find him watching her with infinite patience. It is a lot." "Of course," nodded Thomas, reclining in his chair. "Take all the time you need. The storm will not subside until tomorrow, by the looks of it. We have all night." But even as he said it, both knew that the decision was already being made in Margaret's heart, in that part of her that had survived the scandal and abandonment, that refused to surrender, that still believed she deserved more than a life of shame and isolation. At dawn, when the storm had finally calmed and the sun appeared timidly between the scattered clouds, Margaret Astor gave her answer. Yes, she would marry Thomas Hearst. And as they sealed the agreement with a formal and strangely intimate handshake, neither could imagine that this marriage of convenience planted on a stormy night would blossom into something that would change not only their lives, but the destiny of everyone around them. But not everyone would receive the news with joy. In an elegant mansion on the other side of Newport, Constance Vandermeer, a beautiful woman of 30 with jet-black hair and eyes that could appear as emeralds or ice depending on her mood, dropped her porcelain cup when her maid brought her the news. Thomas Hearst, the man she had discreetly courted for 2 years, the man who had rejected all her elegant advances, would marry the disgraced Margaret Astor in 2 weeks. The rage that surged in Constance's chest was so intense that for a moment she could not breathe. But when she finally recovered her composure, a cold smile curved her perfectly painted lips. If Thomas Hearst thought he could spurn her that way, he was very much mistaken. And if Margaret Astor thought she had found a safe refuge, she would soon discover that some enemies never forgive or forget. Chapter 3. The marriage was celebrated in a private ceremony in the chapel of the Hearst property, a stone structure covered with ivy that had witnessed 3 generations of family weddings, baptisms and funerals. Only the priest, Mrs. Brennan, Thomas's lawyer, and naturally William and Clara were present. Margaret wore a wedding gown of ivory satin that had belonged to her mother, with puffed sleeves and a fitted bodice adorned with Brussels lace. It was not the elaborate wedding gown she had imagined years before, but it had a simple elegance that suited the solemnity of the moment perfectly. Thomas, impeccable in his dark frock coat, looked at her with an expression Margaret could not entirely decipher: relief, satisfaction, or perhaps a hint of something deeper. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas bent and brushed his lips against Margaret's cheek in a chaste and formal kiss. But even that minimal contact sent an electric current through her skin. a promise of possibilities she did not yet dare to explore. The Hearst mansion, located in the heart of Bellevue Avenue, was an imposing three-story structure built in neo-Renaissance style, with a white marble facade, arched windows and gardens that seemed taken from an Italian painting. Margaret, accustomed to the decadence of her own house, felt overwhelmed by the opulence of the place. The polished parquet floors, the crystal chandeliers hanging from frescoed ceilings, the French tapestries covering the walls of the main salon. But more than the material wealth, what struck her was the warmth. Despite its grandeur, the house had a lived-in air with children's toys scattered through the sitting room, open books on side tables, and the persistent aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchens. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Walsh, a robust woman of about 50, with a kind face and eyes that saw everything, received her with respectful curtsy but evaluating eyes. "Welcome, Mrs. Hearst," she said, and Margaret felt a chill at hearing her new name. "If you need anything, you need only ask. Mrs. Catherine," and here the woman's voice softened with affection and sorrow. "Always said that this house should be a home, not a museum. I hope you feel the same way." Margaret nodded, moved by the words. "I will do everything in my power to honor her memory and care well for this family." The first days were a whirlwind of adaptation. Margaret woke in a sumptuous bedroom decorated in shades of blue and gold, in a four-poster bed so large she felt lost in it. Her bedroom was connected to Thomas's by a door that remained closed each night, a silent reminder that this was a marriage of convenience, not passion. He was invariably courteous, asking her during breakfast if she had slept well, if she needed anything, if she was pleased with the house. But there was a careful distance between them, as if both were afraid of getting too close and discovering that the agreement they had made was a terrible mistake. The children, however, were another matter. Clara, with the devastating frankness of 5 years old, had immediately decided that Margaret was a wonderful gift the storm had brought them. She clung to Margaret's skirts like a limpet, asking her 1,000 questions about any topic that crossed her curious mind, begging her to read stories before bedtime, insisting she try her favorite cookies. Margaret, who had never been around small children, found herself simultaneously exhausted and enchanted by that effusive creature. William was harder to win over. At 8 years old, he had already developed a seriousness that seemed too heavy for someone so young. He watched Margaret with wariness, as if expecting that at any moment she would reveal her true nature, and disappoint him as apparently every other adult had done. But Margaret was patient. She did not force her affection, did not pretend to be something she was not. She simply was present, helping him with his lessons when he allowed it, listening when he finally began to talk about his interests. Ships, steam engines, the architectural plans his father showed him of the factories. It was during one of those conversations, 3 weeks after the wedding, that Margaret realized Thomas was watching them from the doorway of the library. There was an expression on his face she had not seen before, something soft and warm that transformed his stern features into something almost vulnerable. When their eyes met, he did not look away. Instead, he smiled, a small but genuine smile, and Margaret felt something inside her chest, something that had been frozen for a long time, begin to slowly thaw. But while the Hearst family was beginning to come together, in the drawing rooms of Newport, nets of malice and envy were being woven. Constance Vandermeer had remained surprisingly quiet after the wedding, making none of the caustic comments everyone expected. This should have been a warning, for Constance was not the sort of woman who accepted defeat gracefully. She was, on the contrary, the sort of woman who meticulously planned her revenge, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The opportunity came when Thomas proposed that he and Margaret organize a charitable ball to raise funds for Newport's new hospital. It was a project he was passionate about, a way to give something back to the community that had enriched his family. "It will be your official presentation in society as my wife," he explained to Margaret one evening at dinner. "An opportunity to show everyone that the rumors about you are unfounded, that you are a woman of character and compassion." Margaret had accepted, though the idea of facing the high society that had rejected her caused her more anxiety than she wanted to admit. For weeks, she immersed herself in the preparations, designing invitations with Mrs. Walsh, selecting the menu with the chef, choosing the flowers and music. Thomas worked beside her, surprising her with his attention to detail and his willingness to listen to her ideas. There were moments when their hands brushed accidentally while reviewing lists, moments when their laughter mixed over some shared anecdote, moments when Margaret looked up and found him watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "What are you thinking when you look at me that way?" she dared to ask him one afternoon while they were alone in the study reviewing the event's budget. Thomas seemed surprised by the question, as if unaware of his own expression. "I am thinking," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "about how wrong I was to believe I could maintain this marriage purely as a matter of convenience. I am thinking about how difficult it is to be near you, and remember that I promised to demand nothing beyond what we agreed. I am thinking," and here his voice became a hoarse whisper, "about how beautiful you look when you smile, and how much I wish to be the man who brings that smile to your face each day." The air between them charged with electricity. Margaret felt she could not breathe, that the world had narrowed to the greyish-blue eyes watching her with a yearning that echoed her own. "Thomas," she began, not knowing what to say, how to express that she felt the same, that the wall around her heart was crumbling stone by stone. But before she could continue, the study door burst open and William ran in, holding a toy boat that had broken. The moment shattered, and Thomas pulled away, composing his expression into something more neutral as he attended to his son. Margaret remained there, her heart racing wildly, aware that something fundamental had changed between them, something that could not be ignored much longer. The charity ball was held on a perfect October evening, with the full moon casting a silvery path over the ocean and stars shining like diamonds against the velvet black sky. The Hearst mansion had been transformed into a fairy tale palace, with thousands of candles illuminating the rooms, floral arrangements of white roses and blue hydrangeas on every surface, and an orchestra of 15 musicians playing waltzes in the ballroom. Guests arrived in elegant carriages, the ladies wearing their finest satin and velvet gowns, the gentlemen impeccable in dark evening coats and white gloves. Margaret, dressed in a midnight blue velvet evening gown with a boat neckline and puffed sleeves, her light brown hair gathered into an elaborate chignon from which soft curls escaped, received guests alongside Thomas in the main vestibule. She could feel the evaluating stares, hear the barely concealed whispers, but she held her head high and maintained a serene smile on her lips. Thomas, beside her, was a comforting presence, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, a silent declaration that she was under his protection. If you enjoyed seeing the main couple face their first major social challenge together, show your support by giving us a like. This story is just beginning, and the trials that will come will test not only their budding love, but their very ability to survive in a world that offers no forgiveness. Everything seemed to be going perfectly until Constance Vandermeer made her entrance. She arrived late, a calculated tactic to ensure everyone noticed her. She wore a blood-red evening gown that contrasted dramatically with her pale skin and black hair, with a neckline low enough to border on impropriety. Her green eyes gleamed with a dangerous light as she approached Margaret and Thomas, a cold smile curving her crimson lips. "Dear Thomas," she purred, completely ignoring Margaret, "what a wonderful evening you have organized. Though I must confess my surprise to see that you have chosen as hostess someone with such a questionable reputation. But I suppose love blinds us to obvious defects." The insult was so blatant that several nearby guests held their breath. Thomas stiffened, his jaws clenched, but before he could respond, Margaret gently placed her hand on his arm and addressed Constance with a voice soft yet firm as steel. "Miss Vandermeer," she said, emphasizing the miss with delicate cruelty, "how kind of you to join our charitable cause. The hospital will be grateful for your generous donation, I am sure. After all, true nobility is measured not by the words we speak, but by the actions we take for others' benefit. I hope that tonight will be remembered for the compassion demonstrated, not for the petty attempts of some to sow discord. It was a masterful strike, executed with such elegance that Constance was momentarily speechless. Margaret had transformed the insult into an opportunity to remind everyone of the true purpose of the evening, while subtly pointing out Constance's lack of grace. The guests who had witnessed the exchange began to murmur with approval, and Constance, realizing she had lost this round, withdrew with a look that promised retribution. The evening continued with success. Margaret danced the first waltz with Thomas, and as he guided her across the room with surprising grace for a man his size, she allowed herself, for the first time in years, to feel truly happy. "You are handling this wonderfully," Thomas murmured against her ear, his warm breath sending shivers down her neck. "You are stronger than I believed possible." "I learned from the best teacher," Margaret answered with an ironic smile. "Adversity has a way of forging steel from soft iron." But Constance Vandermeer was not a woman who accepted defeat. Over the following weeks, she began a systematic and meticulous campaign to destroy Margaret. She did not do it openly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she operated in the shadows, planting seeds of doubt with the precision of a malevolent gardener. A comment here about seeing Margaret receive mysterious letters. An insinuation there about improper behavior observed during her days of seclusion. A whispered rumor that the real reason for her broken engagement had been an infidelity that Edward's family had preferred to keep secret to protect their own name. None of the accusations were open or specific, which made them even more damaging because there was nothing concrete to refute. They were like poison dripping slowly into Newport's water supply, contaminating everything without being seen. Thomas, absorbed in a crucial business project that required frequent trips to New York, initially did not notice what was happening. Margaret, proud and reluctant to worry him with what she believed were mere insignificant gossip, did not mention it to him. But the true blow came during an afternoon tea organized by Mrs. Astor, the great lady of Newport society and Margaret's distant cousin. It was an event that high society ladies attended religiously, and Margaret had been invited by virtue of her new status as wife of Thomas Hearst. She dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a lavender silk day dress with long sleeves and high collar, her hair gathered in an elegant but modest style. Mrs. Astor received her with cold cordiality in her opulent salon, where another 20 ladies were already seated in golden chairs, holding delicate cups of Chinese porcelain. Margaret recognized several of them as former acquaintances, women who had been kind to her before the scandal, but now their expressions were a mixture of curiosity and something darker, malicious anticipation, as if they expected to witness a spectacle. Constance, of course, was there, seated in a prominent position beside the hostess, her emerald green gown matching her cruel eyes. When Margaret took her seat, Constance waited for exactly the right moment, when the conversation had fallen into a momentary silence, to drop her bomb. "Margaret, dear," she said in a voice sweet as poisoned honey, "I have been wanting to ask you about those letters you used to receive at your house during your period of seclusion. My maid, who is cousin to your former cook, mentioned that quite regular correspondence arrived from New York, always in the same masculine hand. It must have been very comforting to have a friend during those difficult times." The salon fell into absolute silence. All eyes turned toward Margaret, waiting for her reaction. It was a perfect trap. If she denied the letters, she would appear to be lying, but if she admitted them, she would confirm implications of impropriety. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face, but she maintained her composure with an effort of will that left her trembling inside. "The only letters I received," she said in a clear and firm voice, "were from my lawyer in New York regarding matters of the family property. I am sorry that your maid misinterpreted legal correspondence as something more romantic, but I suppose that those with minds inclined toward scandal see impropriety where only routine exists. It was a good response, but the damage was already done." Margaret could see the doubt in the other lady's eyes, the way they exchanged meaningful looks. Constance had accomplished her goal, planting the seed of suspicion, making everyone question whether perhaps, just perhaps, there was some truth to the old rumors about Margaret. The afternoon ended in agony. Margaret remained until the end, drinking her tea and engaging in superficial conversation, with a grace that hid the storm raging inside her. But when she finally boarded her carriage for the return journey to the Hearst mansion, she allowed herself to finally collapse, the tears she had held back for hours flowing freely down her cheeks. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, Thomas returned early from New York. He found Margaret in the conservatory, seated among the orchids and ferns, gazing at the darkened gardens with eyes that reflected a pain he recognized all too well. Without speaking, he sat beside her and took her hand between his, large and warm and surprisingly comforting. "Tell me everything," he said simply, and something in his voice, in the genuine concern it radiated, broke down the last of Margaret's defenses. She told him about Constance, about the rumors, about the afternoon tea and the perfectly executed trap. Thomas listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each word, a cold fury burning in his eyes. "This ends now," he declared when she finally finished. "Constance Vandermeer has crossed a line she should never have crossed. But Margaret—" And here he turned his body to face her completely, taking her face gently between his hands, with a tenderness that made her heart stop. "I need you to know something. I do not care what they say. I do not care about the rumors or the insinuations. I have come to know you in these months. I have seen your kindness with my children, your strength in the face of adversity, your grace under pressure, and I have realized something terrifying and wonderful at the same time." "What?" whispered Margaret, barely daring to breathe. "That I have fallen in love with you," confessed Thomas, and the words came out as if they had been contained too long, like a river breaking through a dam. "It was not part of the plan. It was not what we agreed to, but the heart does not obey contracts or promises of convenience. I love you, Margaret. I love your intelligence, your compassion, your courage. I love the way you read stories to Clara with different voices for each character. I love how you listen patiently to William talk about machines for hours. I love your laugh when you think no one is listening. I love you, completely and without reservation, and I will not allow anyone, much less Constance Vandermeer, to hurt you again." Margaret could not contain the sob that burst from her chest, but this time they were tears of joy mixed with relief, and a love so overwhelming that she thought her heart would burst. "I love you too," she confessed, using "you" for the first time, an intimacy that crossed the formal barrier they had maintained. "I do not know exactly when it happened, but at some point you stopped being a stranger who offered me shelter and became the center of my world." The kiss they shared was different from anything Margaret had experienced. It was not the chaste kiss of their wedding ceremony, nor the formal brush of cheeks they had exchanged until now. It was deep, passionate, filled with months of contained longing and promises of a future they would face together. When they finally separated, both were breathless, and Thomas rested his forehead against hers with a smile that completely transformed his stern face. "We will face Constance together," he promised, "and we will show her exactly how wrong she was to underestimate us." But neither Thomas nor Margaret could imagine how far Constance was willing to go to destroy them. While they discovered their love in the conservatory, Constance was in her own study, meticulously writing letters with handwriting she had practiced for weeks until she perfected a convincing imitation. Letters that appeared to have been written by Margaret to an imaginary lover, filled with confessions of illicit passions and secret encounters. Letters she planned to accidentally discover and circulate among high society, destroying not only Margaret's reputation, but also endangering Thomas's business, because who would want to associate with a man whose wife was an adulteress? The storm that was brewing would make the tempest that had united Thomas and Margaret seem like a gentle breeze. And this time, the shelter they would need would not be a physical cabin, but the fortress of their newly confessed love. Chapter 4. The spring of 1889 arrived in Newport with an explosion of colors, golden daffodils sprouting in the gardens, cherry trees in bloom painting the landscape in pink and white, and the air filled with the intoxicating perfume of lilacs. But for Margaret Hearst, the beauty of spring's rebirth contrasted bitterly with the nightmare unfolding around her. Everything began with an anonymous letter that reached the hands of Mrs. Astor, the undisputed matriarch of Newport society. The letter, written on cheap paper and in crude handwriting, alleged that the writer had witnessed secret meetings between Margaret and an unknown man in the days before her marriage to Thomas. It provided no specific details or evidence, but it was provocative enough to awaken curiosity and fuel gossip. Thomas and Margaret were having breakfast with the children when Thomas's lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, arrived with alarming news. "The letter is circulating," he informed them with grave expression, declining the cup of coffee Margaret offered. "It has already been seen by at least a dozen of the most influential families. And there is more. Someone is sending packages to several prominent homes, supposedly containing documentary evidence of the allegations." Margaret felt the ground open beneath her feet. Evidence? What kind of evidence? There cannot be evidence of something that never happened. But when Pemberton removed one of the forged letters from his briefcase and showed it to her, Margaret understood with chilling horror just how meticulously Constance had planned her destruction. The letter was written on paper that appeared aged, with handwriting that was a disturbingly precise imitation of her own. It spoke of passionate encounters, of forbidden love, of plans to escape together. It was dated just weeks before the storm that had brought her to Thomas. "It is false," Margaret said with a trembling voice, passing the letter to Thomas with hands she could not control. "Every word is a lie. I never wrote this. I never knew any lover. I never—" "I know it is false," Thomas interrupted firmly, though his eyes had taken on a hardness that promised terrible retribution. "I know it is false, but Constance has been very clever. The forgery is so good that even experts in handwriting analysis would have difficulty proving it is not your hand. And the content is specifically designed to confirm all the rumors she has been spreading for months." Over the following days, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. The invitations that had begun arriving again after the charity ball stopped abruptly. The ladies whom Margaret had considered friends crossed the street to avoid her when she went shopping. Worse still, some of Thomas's business partners began to distance themselves, worried that the scandal might taint their own reputations by association. Thomas fought fiercely in her defense. He personally visited every important family, bringing with him experts who could testify to the inconsistencies in the forged letters. He hired private investigators to trace the origin of the paper and ink. He threatened defamation suits against anyone who repeated the accusations, but it was like trying to stop a flood with bare hands. The rumors multiplied faster than they could refute them, mutating and growing with each repetition. The pressure began to affect even the children. William came home one day with a black eye after fighting with a classmate who had called Margaret a fallen woman. Clara, too young to fully understand what was happening, but perceptive enough to feel the tension, began to have nightmares and refused to leave Margaret's side. Seeing the children suffer because of Constance's lies broke Margaret's heart in ways nothing else had managed. The straw that broke the camel's back came during a crucial meeting with potential investors for Thomas's new railroad project. It was a contract worth millions, one that would employ thousands of workers and cement Thomas's legacy as one of the great industrialists of the era. But one of the principal investors, a Boston banker named Cornelius Whitmore, had withdrawn his support, citing concerns about the moral stability of the Hearst family. Thomas returned from that meeting with an expression Margaret had never seen on his face: defeat mixed with barely contained fury. For the first time, there was a crack in his armor, a hint of doubt about whether they could survive this storm together. "Perhaps," Margaret said that night while they were in their bedroom, her words coming with difficulty as if each one tore a piece from her soul, "perhaps it would be better if I left, if I returned to my house in ruins, if we annulled the marriage. Your reputation would recover, the children would stop suffering, your business." Thomas stopped her with a kiss so fierce, so desperate and possessive that it left her breathless. "Never," he growled against her lips. "Never will I let you go from my side. If the entire world turns its back on us, then to hell with the world. You are my wife. I love you more than my own life, and we will find a way to defeat Constance." But even as he spoke those brave words, both knew they were losing the battle, and then came the final blow. Thomas received notification that his principal partners in New York had voted to remove him from the board of directors of his own company, citing the scandal as reason. It was a monumental betrayal, orchestrated no doubt by Constance using her connections and her poisonous tongue. That night Margaret made a decision. She could not stay and watch the man she loved lose everything he had built. She could not bear to see William and Clara suffer any longer. With her heart shattered into a million pieces, she secretly packed a small suitcase, waited until Thomas was deeply asleep, and left a letter on the pillow beside him. In it, she explained that she loved him too much to be the cause of his ruin, that she would always cherish the months they had shared, but that she had to free him before Constance completely destroyed his life. She left the Hearst mansion under the cover of darkness, carrying only the clothes on her back and the small amount of money she had saved. Her plan was to return to her old house, live there in complete seclusion, perhaps find work as a teacher or seamstress under an assumed name. Whatever was necessary to disappear from Thomas's life and allow him to rebuild. But Margaret had underestimated two things. First, how deep Thomas's love for her was, and second, how far Constance had gone in her arrogance of believing she had completely won. Thomas awoke less than an hour after Margaret left, alerted by some sixth sense that something was wrong. When he found the letter, the roar of anguish and rage that erupted from his chest woke the entire house. Within minutes he had sent riders in all directions to find her, mobilizing every resource at his disposal. Meanwhile, Margaret had reached her old property and locked herself in the only room that still had a solid roof. She was crying bitterly, hugging herself, when she heard voices outside. For a moment of irrational hope, she thought perhaps Thomas had found her. But when she opened the door, she found herself face to face with someone completely unexpected. Mrs. Walsh, the head housekeeper of the Hearst mansion, accompanied by Mrs. Brennan. "I thought I would find you here," said Mrs. Walsh with a mixture of reproval and compassion. "Did you really believe that Mr. Hearst would let you go just like that? That he would give up the woman he loves without fighting?" Margaret sobbed. "It is the only way. As long as I am with him, Constance will continue to destroy everything he has built." "Then it is time we stopped running and started fighting for real," said a voice from the shadows. Margaret was startled when another figure emerged. It was Jonathan Whitmore, the son of the banker who had withdrawn his investment. He was a young man of about 25, whom Margaret barely remembered meeting at the charity ball. "I have been investigating Constance Vandermeer on my own," explained Jonathan, approaching with a serious expression. "You see, my father was also a victim of her manipulations years ago. She invented rumors about a supposed affair he had with an actress, nearly destroyed his marriage to my mother. He managed to stop her only by paying her a considerable sum of money, but I have always wanted to expose her for what she really is, an extortionist and a liar." Margaret stared at him in astonishment. "Why would you help me?" "Because I am tired of seeing good people destroyed by the malice of a woman without scruples, and because—" Here Jonathan pulled a bundle of papers from his jacket. "I have found evidence, real evidence. Constance was careless in her arrogance. She hired a professional forger from Boston to create the letters, but the man kept copies of the original letters from Margaret that Constance provided him as a sample of her handwriting. He also kept correspondence from her, giving him specific instructions about what to include in the forgeries." Margaret's heart began to beat with hope for the first time in days. "Where is this man now?" "In my carriage, waiting. He is willing to testify publicly in exchange for immunity and protection. Constance betrayed him, did not pay the full agreed amount, and now he seeks revenge." It was the opportunity they needed, the turn of fate that could change everything. Margaret, Mrs. Walsh, Mrs. Brennan, and Jonathan immediately began to plan. The great spring ball of the Astor family would be held in 3 days. The most important social event of the season. Constance would undoubtedly attend, anticipating her complete triumph. It would be the perfect stage for their final confrontation. When Thomas finally found Margaret hours later, riding frantically to the abandoned property, he found her not crying and defeated as he had feared, but surrounded by allies, planning strategy, with a determination burning in her eyes that rivaled his own. He embraced her with such force that he nearly lifted her from the ground, murmuring words of love and relief against her hair. "I thought I had lost you," he confessed with a broken voice, "and I realized that without you nothing else matters. Not the money, not the power, not the social position, nothing." "You have not lost me," Margaret answered, taking his face between her hands and looking at him with all the strength of her love. "And you never will. But now, my love, it is time we showed Constance Vandermeer that she chose the wrong enemies." Chapter 5. The night of the Astor family's spring ball, The air was charged with the electricity of an approaching storm, though the sky remained clear and studded with stars. Margaret dressed with meticulous care, choosing an evening gown of champagne satin with pearl embroidery that caught the light with her every movement. Her hair was gathered in an elaborate style that exposed the elegant length of her neck, where rested the sapphire necklace Thomas had given her that very morning. "So you remember," he had said while fastening it around her throat, "that you are my wife, my love, and my equal in all things." Thomas, impeccable in his black frock coat with grey satin waistcoat and perfectly tied bow tie, waited for her at the bottom of the stairs with an expression of adoration and pride that made Margaret's heart race. When she descended, he took her hand and kissed it with a formality that barely concealed the passion burning between them. "You are ready," he murmured, not as a question, but as an affirmation. "Let us end this." The carriage that carried them to the Astor Ball was followed discreetly by another in which travelled Jonathan Whitmore, the repentant forger who presented himself as Mr. Davies, and Attorney Pemberton with folders full of documented evidence. They had coordinated every detail with the precision of generals planning a battle, because that was exactly what it was, the final battle against Constance Vandermeer. The Astor mansion gleamed like a beacon in the night, its windows casting golden rectangles onto perfectly manicured gardens. The sound of the orchestra floated on the spring air along with the laughter and conversation of the 300 guests who had already arrived. Margaret could feel the stares as they entered the ballroom on Thomas's arm, could hear the sudden silence followed by feverish whispers, but she held her head high, a serene smile on her lips, projecting a confidence she did not entirely feel but refused to let anyone see. Constance Vandermeer was in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a circle of admirers, wearing an emerald green velvet gown that matched her eyes. When she saw Margaret and Thomas, her expression of triumph faltered for a moment, replaced by something close to surprise. Clearly she had not expected them to have the audacity to appear, much less to do so projecting such unity and dignity. The evening proceeded with an almost tangible tension. Margaret and Thomas danced, conversed with other guests, acted as though nothing extraordinary was about to happen. But every movement was calculated, every word carefully chosen. They were setting the stage for what would come. It was after dinner, when the guests had gathered in the main salon to hear a famous soprano, specially brought from the Metropolitan Opera in New York, that the moment arrived. Thomas had arranged discreetly with Mrs. Astor for him to address the guests before the musical performance. The matriarch, intrigued by his urgent request and his promise to reveal truths important to Newport society, had agreed. Thomas stood in the center of the ballroom, his imposing presence immediately commanding everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in a clear, resonant voice, "I thank you for your patience in allowing me a few moments of your time. For the past months, my wife and I have been subjected to malicious rumors, unfounded accusations, and a systematic campaign of defamation specifically designed to destroy not only our reputation, but also our marriage and my ability to conduct business." The ballroom fell into absolute silence. Margaret could see Constance tense, her green eyes narrowing with alarm, as she rapidly calculated whether she should withdraw or hold her position. "Initially," Thomas continued, "we attempted to defend our honor through private means, trusting that truth would prevail. But we were facing an enemy who had perfected the art of lying, who operated in the shadows, planting seeds of doubt with the precision of someone who has much practice in destroying lives." He now addressed directly the spot where Constance stood, pale, but still maintaining her mask of offended innocence. "Constance Vandermeer, for 2 years, I attempted to politely reject your advances, making clear that my heart had not yet healed from my wife's death. When I finally found love again with Margaret, you could not accept that a man might prefer another woman to you, and so you decided to destroy what you could not have." "This is outrageous," exclaimed Constance, her voice trembling with fabricated indignation. "How dare you accuse me publicly without evidence? I never—" "Without evidence?" interrupted Thomas with a cold smile. "On the contrary, I have all the evidence necessary, Mr. Davies, if you would be so kind." The forger stepped forward from where he had been waiting discreetly on the side, He was a middle-aged man with ordinary appearance who would pass unnoticed in any crowd, but when he spoke his voice was clear and without remorse. "My name is Edmund Davies, and I make my living by forging documents. It is not a profession of which I am proud, but it is one I master. 3 months ago I was hired by Miss Vandermeer," he pointed directly at Constance, "to create a series of letters that appeared to have been written by Mrs. Margaret Hearst to a supposed lover. She provided me with samples of Mrs. Hearst's handwriting, specific instructions about what the letters should contain, and even details about what type of paper and ink to use to make them appear authentic." The ballroom erupted into murmurs of shock. Constance had lost all color from her face, but still attempted to maintain her composure. "He is lying," she hissed. "This is a conspiracy designed by them to—" "I kept copies," Davies continued, undeterred, while Attorney Pemberton began distributing documents among the guests. "I kept the original instructions written in Miss Vandermeer's own hand. I kept drafts of the forgeries, and I kept notes from my meetings with her, where we discussed exactly how to destroy Mrs. Hearst's reputation in the most effective way possible." Margaret watched as Constance's mask finally began to crack. The woman looked frantically around, searching for an exit or support, but found only faces showing shock, disgust, and in some cases, satisfaction from those who had also been victims of her manipulations in the past. "Why?" asked Mrs. Astor with an icy voice, addressing Constance directly. "Why do something so despicable?" Constance, cornered and without escape, seemed to break completely. "Why?" she repeated with a hysterical laugh. "Because she did not deserve it. A ruined woman, a disgrace to society, and yet Thomas chose her over me. I, who am of better family, more beautiful, better connected. It was not fair. So I decided to remind everyone exactly what kind of woman Margaret Astor was. I decided to make sure that Thomas Hearst regretted the day he rejected me." The silence that followed her confession was so profound you could have heard a pin drop. And then something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Astor, the great matriarch whose verdict could make or destroy reputations, rose from her seat and walked with measured steps to where Margaret stood beside Thomas. "Margaret Hearst," she said in a voice clear enough to reach every corner of the ballroom, "I owe you an apology. I, along with many others in this room, was too quick to judge, too willing to believe rumors without substance. You have demonstrated a grace and strength under pressure that many of us do not possess, and it is evident that the scandal that ruined you originally was as fabricated as these recent accusations." She turned to address the entire ballroom. "Let it be clear from this moment forward that Margaret Hearst is welcome in all respectable homes in Newport. Anyone who continues to spread calumnies against her will find themselves excluded from the society they so value." It was as if a dam had burst. One by one, guests began to approach Margaret, offering apologies, expressing shame at having doubted her, congratulating her on her victory. Thomas remained beside her, his hand on the small of her back, a solid anchor as waves of vindication broke around her. Constance attempted to slip discreetly toward the exit, but found her way blocked by Jonathan Whitmore. "Not so fast," said the young man with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "My father and several other families whom you have extorted over the years are pressing legal charges. You will not go to prison," he added, and Margaret felt a flash of satisfaction, remembering they had been careful to ensure justice was served without crossing lines that might reflect negatively on them. "But your reputation is destroyed, your bank accounts will be drained by lawsuits, and no respectable door will open to you again." Constance looked at them all with pure hatred in her green eyes, but said nothing more. She left the Astor mansion with her back straight, but everyone knew her power had ended, that her reign of terror through rumors and manipulation had come to an end. Later that night, after the soprano had sung, and the guests had danced and the evening had ended in complete triumph for the Hearsts, Thomas and Margaret finally returned home. They climbed the stairs toward their bedroom, and for the first time since their wedding, Thomas followed Margaret through the door that connected their rooms, closing it gently behind him. "It is over," he murmured, holding her close. "It is finally over." Margaret melted against him, feeling the tension of months drain from her body. "We really won," she whispered, still barely able to believe it. "We truly did." "No, my love," corrected Thomas, bending to capture her lips in a kiss that promised passions they had been containing for too long. "We did not simply win. We triumphed. Together." And now, he lifted her into his arms, prompting a surprised laugh from her. "It is time we truly begin our marriage, not as a matter of convenience, but as what it should always have been, a union of true and lasting love." And as the moon shone over Newport and the Atlantic waves broke gently against the cliffs, Thomas and Margaret Hearst finally claimed the happiness they had earned through the fire of adversity, forged together into something stronger than steel, more lasting than the stones of the mansion surrounding them, deeper than the ocean that had witnessed their first meeting. They had found not only shelter in each other, but a true home, built on the unbreakable foundation of true love. After witnessing this overwhelming victory of love over malice, after seeing how Margaret and Thomas not only survived, but triumphed over those who tried to destroy them, we invite you to subscribe to our channel to not miss other exciting stories of love, redemption, and justice. Press the subscribe button now and join us on more journeys through the passions and triumphs of the past. Epilogue. 5 years had passed since that memorable night at the Astor mansion, 5 years that had transformed the Hearsts' lives in ways neither could have imagined during that providential storm that had first brought them together. Margaret stood in the garden of the mansion, now renovated and expanded with a new wing dedicated entirely to the library and music room she had personally designed. The June sun of 1894 bathed the rose bushes in bloom that she herself had planted, creating a sea of reds, pinks, and whites that extended as far as the eye could see. In her arms, she held her small daughter, Catherine Rose, 2 years old, whose golden blonde hair and grayish-blue eyes were a perfect blend of her parents. Beside her, on a blanket spread over the lawn, her son, James Thomas, nearly 4 years old, played with wooden blocks under the watchful eye of his older brother, William. William, now 13 years old, had become a handsome and serious young man who had inherited his father's business acumen and Margaret's compassion. He already spoke of following in Thomas's footsteps in the steel business, but Margaret and Thomas encouraged him to explore his interests in architecture, a field where his creativity could flourish. Clara, 10 years old, was a vivacious and charming young woman who divided her time between piano lessons, riding classes, and what she called her charity missions, visiting the orphanage that Margaret had founded 2 years earlier with funds from her own inheritance, finally recovered after her father, on his deathbed, had asked forgiveness and corrected his will. The orphanage had been just the beginning. Margaret had discovered within herself a passion for philanthropic work that went far beyond what high society considered acceptable for a lady. She had established educational programs for girls from poor families, had fought for better working conditions in Thomas's factories, and had used her position as the wife of one of New England's most powerful men to advocate for changes that many considered radical. Thomas, rather than feeling threatened or embarrassed by his wife's activities, as some men would have been, supported her completely. He had discovered that the woman he had rescued during a storm did not need rescuing at all, but simply needed a partner who believed in her. Together, they had built not only a family, but a legacy of compassion and social justice that was beginning to transform Newport from an exclusive refuge for the ultra-wealthy into a community that cared for all its residents. Thomas's business had flourished beyond all expectations. The scandal that Constance had attempted to create had ended up strengthening his reputation when the truth came to light. Investors who had withdrawn returned with apologies and improved offers. The railroad project that had been in jeopardy was completed with great success, connecting cities and creating thousands of jobs. Thomas Hearst was now one of America's most respected and admired men, not only for his wealth, but for his integrity and the fair treatment he gave his workers. As for Constance Vandermeer, she had disappeared from Newport immediately after her public humiliation. Rumors said she had fled to Europe, where she attempted to reinvent herself among social circles that did not know her past. The civil lawsuits filed against her had drained most of her fortune, and her family, mortified by the scandal, had publicly disowned her. Margaret, surprisingly, felt no satisfaction in her downfall. only sadness for what could have been if Constance had channeled her intelligence and determination toward nobler purposes. Edward Blackwell, the ex-fiancé who had initiated the entire chain of events with his public betrayal, had attempted to approach Margaret a year after her marriage to Thomas, hoping perhaps for a reconciliation or at least an audience. Thomas had personally intercepted his visit and, according to witnesses, had a very brief but decisive conversation with him that ended with Edward leaving pale and trembling, never bothering them again. Margaret never asked what Thomas had told him, and he never offered details. Some secrets between husband and wife were better kept. "What are you thinking, my love?" asked Thomas's deep voice behind her, and Margaret leaned back against his solid chest as he wrapped his arms around her, enclosing both her and little Catherine in his embrace. He had arrived early from his office in the city, something he had begun doing with increasing frequency, prioritizing time with his family over endless meetings. "I was thinking about how we were 5 years ago," answered Margaret, turning her head to look at him. There were a few more grey streaks in his temples now, and expression lines around his eyes that spoke of years of smiles and laughter. He remained the most handsome man she had ever known, but it was the kindness in his eyes, the gentle strength in his hands, the way he looked at her, as if she were his sun and his moon, that made him truly beautiful to her. Two strangers taking shelter from a storm, neither of us expecting to find anything more than temporary refuge, and look at us now. "We built an empire," joked Thomas, but his voice was soft with emotion. "Not one of steel and rails, but of love and family. The kind of empire that really matters, the only kind worth defending with every breath." Catherine stirred in Margaret's arms, reaching her chubby little hands toward her father. Thomas took her with practiced ease, lifting her high until her crystalline laughter filled the garden. William and Clara approached, followed by little James toddling on legs not yet completely steady, and for a perfect moment, all 7 were together, a complete and true family, bathed in the golden light of the summer sun. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was silent except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, Thomas and Margaret found each other, as they always did at day's end, in the bedroom they now shared completely, with no closed doors between them. They lay in bed, their bodies intertwined in the comfortable intimacy of couples who know each other completely, when Margaret spoke softly in the darkness. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "proposing marriage to me that night, having to go through all we endured?" Thomas propped himself on an elbow so he could see her clearly in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Every scar we bear," he said with absolute conviction, "every tear we shed, every battle we fought, was worth it to reach this moment, to have you in my arms each night, to see your smile each morning, to build this life with you. I would not change a single moment, not even the most painful ones, because they all brought us here." He kissed her then, long and deeply, a kiss that held 5 years of growing love, of passion that never diminished, of a commitment that had strengthened rather than weakened with time. And Margaret, kissing him back with equal fervor, knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home, not in a marble mansion or among high society families, but in the arms of this man who had seen her at her worst moment and chosen to love her anyway. The storm that had brought them together so long ago had long since passed, but the love that had been born under its thunder and lightning burned as brightly as ever, a light no darkness could extinguish, a shelter no tempest could destroy. They had begun as strangers seeking only to escape the rain, and had become partners, lovers, confidants, everything to each other, together facing whatever the future might bring. And as Newport slept beneath the stars, and the waves sang their eternal song against the cliffs, Thomas and Margaret Hearst, 2 souls whom destiny had united and love had forged into one, fell asleep in each other's arms, surrounded by the family they had created and the love that had defied all odds to not only survive, but flourish beyond any dream they had dared to dream. The story of Margaret and Thomas reminds us of a profound truth we often forget in our rush to judge and be judged, that second chances are not only possible, but sometimes they are the most valuable. Margaret had been discarded by society, considered ruined and unworthy, but she did not allow the world's verdict to define her value. Thomas had closed his heart, convinced that true love comes only once in a lifetime. but he had the courage to open himself again to the possibility of happiness. Together, they proved that true character is not revealed on days of easy triumph, but in how we rise after falling, in how we fight when all seems lost, in how we choose love even when hatred would be easier. Their victory over Constance was not simply the exposure of a villain, but proof that truth and integrity ultimately prevail, though the path be long and painful. They teach us that true love is not that of fairy tales, where everything is perfect from the start, but the kind that is built day by day, trial by trial, choice after choice to stay together no matter the cost. It is the love that makes us better versions of ourselves, that gives us the strength to face our worst fears and most implacable enemies. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that it is never too late to start anew, to find purpose and passion, to build something beautiful from the ruins of what was. On our channel you will find many other stories of love, redemption, and triumph that will move you and make you believe again in the transformative power of true devotion. We invite you to comment on what most impacted you about Margaret and Thomas's story, what lessons you will take with you, and what you hope to see in future narratives. Your opinion is invaluable to us, and every comment helps us continue bringing you stories that touch heart and soul. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Newport in 1888, for opening your hearts to Margaret and Thomas, for crying with their sorrows and celebrating their triumphs. Until the next story, may true love find you as it found our protagonists, in the most unexpected moment and in the most wonderful way. With affection and gratitude, the team of our channel. Subscribe right now to not miss our upcoming exciting stories of impossible loves, moving redemptions, and triumphant justices. Every week we bring new narratives that will nourish your soul and remind you why period romances capture our hearts so deeply. We will see you in the next story.